The way we take care of ourselves is ever evolving.
And what we know for sure is that our mind and spirit are linked to our physical body.
And that our wellness seems to extend into our communities and the planet we all share.
It is very, very clear that wellness is interconnected.
We love spending time with you to explore and practice the breakthroughs, the insights, and the passions of incredible people helping us all see the world in a whole new light.
This is Health Gig.
Today, Tricia and I are excited to have Mary Beth Albright join us to talk about her book, Eat and Flourish, How Food Supports Emotional Well-Being. Welcome to Health Gig, Mary Beth.
Oh, thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. It's great.
Dora and I had our pre-meeting this morning. We were going through everything, and we got more excited as we were talking. And at the end, she goes, you know what's so great about this book is it's so science-based, and it's looking at the microbiome and the gut in a way that Mary Beth did it science-like. And we're like, oh, that's so good because we need to do it based in science. And then she ended it by saying, and also her book is so pretty.
Well, it's so funny because blue books about food don't usually do very well because there are no blue foods in nature. But like I talked to the publisher about it and they were like, yeah, and it's selling very well. So good.
There's no blue foods in nature, like blueberries.
Yeah, there are just a few of them. And that sometimes blue means mold, right? And so there's some sort of human brain interaction. And look, this opens up an entire conversation about food pleasure that we can talk about later.
Yeah, that we can get into
what does
that.
our brain do when it sees specific colors with food? So anyway, we can talk lots more about that.
Well, let's just get started by talking about you. You've had this incredibly diverse career path from working in the Surgeon General's office to the Washington Post. You were on Iron Chef, which is so much fun. Now you've landed here with Eat and Flourish and writing about how food supports emotional well-being. So how did you come to do this book?
I appreciate the question so much because I do get asked that question a lot by people who are interested in making career shifts. I've done a lot of different things, and all of it has been focused on food. So one thing you didn't mention, I was at the law firm of Williams & Connolly for several years, focusing on food. And so I've looked at food from many different perspectives, from the science perspective at the Surgeon General's office. And I also worked for years for C. Everett Koop, who was a legendary Surgeon General in the 1980s. I worked for him in the 1990s. But all of these things that I've done, food writing, food journalism, it's just because I am really interested in how humans choose what to eat and how those choices affect our emotional well-being with no judgment, right? I grew up in diet culture. I think maybe you guys grew up in diet culture, so much so that we didn't even have a phrase for it. It was just the way things were, that if you lived in a larger body, there was something wrong with you. So I became really interested in the line between what is helpful for health outcomes with food and what is getting so obsessive about diet culture that it's actually anti our emotional well-being. And it started when I was at the Surgeon General's office, and for the first time, a research study passed my desk. There was a study that the consumption of omega-3 fatty acids would reduce the symptoms of aggression in men with aggression problems. And that was the first time I had ever seen something that was about food that wasn't relegated to sort of like the complementary and alternative medicine space. The space where people said, yeah, it's great if you want to try it, like prayer, which I'm not kicking prayer out of bed. Prayer has a lot of evidence about it. But people would say these things are fine if you want to try them too, but they're not the main line in first defense. But now we see that food is really a tool in our emotional well-being toolbox, along with medication, along with talk therapy. This isn't like eat a handful of nuts every day and you'll be fine, right? Like there's a lot of real concern in this society about mental health, and food is one way to address it.
In the book, you talk about anxiety. Can you fill us in on that?
Oh, sure. And I have a lot of personal experience with that. I have been diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder and occasional bouts of depression. So this is all very personal for me because I also grew up in a way that food was given or withheld depending on how good you were, what size you were, what your grades were, that kind of thing. And so I did not grow up with positive food messages. nor did I grow up cooking. I didn't learn how to cook until I went to a year-long class at L'Académie de Cuisine, which was a cooking school here in the Washington, D.C. area when I was in my 30s, my early 30s. So I feel that what I bring to this conversation is not just the different facets of food that I can talk about because of my legal education, because of my public health background, because of my food journalism background. I also bring to this conversation the personal experience that every day, this is something I struggle with. Every day, managing not just the anxiety, but also the feeling of like, wow, food is such a crutch. I mean, food as a crutch may have saved my life, and that's a much larger story. And so acknowledging the importance of food, but also being like, okay, I'm an adult now. I am safe no matter what happens to me. And I can treat myself in the way that I wish that I had been treated. And that's what I'm doing for myself. And that is extraordinarily empowering, extraordinarily difficult when you're sitting there and you're like, ooh, ice cream, right? But it is a lifelong journey. I will keep doing this. I am not successful at it every day. I learn every day. And I'm going to keep reading that science. And I'm going to keep up on the science, not just because I feel like it's important for society, not just because I feel it's important for individual health, but because it's important to me. It's very personal too.
It's so fun already to talk to you, Mary Beth, because you can feel your passion and excitement about this. And as you said, we did grow up in the diet culture. I think a lot of us have to work on our relationship with food. And you have a really good way of teaching us this idea is that it is emotional, it is supportive, it's a positive part of our life. And that's amazing to be able to position it that way.
I think the most important message that I can get across is that I'm learning this too. I grew up in diet culture too. I grew up on the less you eat, the better person you are, right? Or if you eat this, then it's some sort of moral hierarchy. To me, there's no truth to that, particularly in a world where a lot of people don't have access to fresh food, right? Because then you're creating a whole kind of class war that nobody wants to get into. It is a social justice issue, I think, having access to fresh food. But also as an individual, I live with this every day. I mean, I am faced with delicious ultra-processed foods too that I love and that have nice memories attached to them. But the main message is that food pleasure is okay. That a lot of us not demonize, but you've heard this probably, that you use like words like sinful or words like craveable or that kind of thing. There's nothing sinful about it. Human pleasure is a basic need. We don't have an RDA of pleasure that we need every day because it's different for everyone and it's not measurable in that way. All pleasures in our body use the same circuitry. Sex uses the same circuitry as art, and looking at great art, as listening to great music, as eating great food. And so our body has this pleasure circuitry. And when you have access to foods that give you so much pleasure so quickly and immediately, and we live in a society where it's okay to eat pretty much anywhere socially, if you're just like unwrapping something and just putting in your mouth. I mean, I can't think of a place where it's not currently socially acceptable to eat, including like a church or, a synagogue. We really need to live in the reality of our human biology. And that's why I was so specific about grounding this in science, because if you don't have that, you have no grasp on reality.
You mentioned the diet culture that we grew up with taught us that eating less is better. I read in your book that one of the things that makes us healthier is eating with others, and we may eat more eating with others.
I call it the feast paradox, that people who eat with other people eat more in that sitting, but they have better health outcomes. And this is really important because in our society, every time, and this is not just in America, but worldwide, every time they take a survey of how many meals do you eat alone, it increases. And it's an increase in single-person households. It's an increase in loneliness. There are a lot of things that are connected with eating alone. But we do find that there is it's not magic, right? It's some kind of health protective effect of being with other people. And one of the ways that humans have been with other people from the beginning of civilization is eating together. And we don't do it anymore. We don't have that moment communally around a fire circle where we sit and we make food together and we share food together. We talk to each other and tell stories and pass things down. Now we sort of have the glow of the hearth of a television showing us other people cooking or other people eating. And that's what we sit around. And there's something clearly that is not as pleasurable, that is not as satiating, as satisfying as being with other people. And again, I include myself in this. I think it was Andy Warhol had this quote that he's like, I want a restaurant that's made for people like me, where you just go and get your dinner and sit in a booth alone and watch television. and basically we have that restaurant wherever you want to go now with your phone or a computer or laptop or whatever, streaming whatever you want. So it's hard to push against that. But again, the message is not perfection. The message is understanding our biology, understanding what's in our best interest, and setting up our lives to make choices that best serve our best interest.
Totally. And I was just wondering, do you think that when you eat alone, as you said, maybe we're watching television and it's stressful stuff, right? Or we're by ourselves and our thoughts go to, oh, I'm lonely. So that idea of you have to rest to digest is interesting, right? Because when you're with people, you're not necessarily resting, but you are relaxed, you are absorbing, you are taking in all the senses that you talk about, the importance of taking in all the senses. So is it more that you're with somebody?
We don't know. There are two things that I want to mention with that. The first one is that dietary studies, any nutrition study, trying to create a causal link between one thing and another is impossible. I know impossible is a big word, but here's why. The human body is an ecosystem. There is no eat a handful of nuts and then don't be depressed. There are a million things that contribute both in our biology and in our social surroundings that contribute to emotional well-being. And I've talked about depression specifically, but depression and anxiety are specifically interesting to me because I live with those problems, right? I live with those diagnoses. But to me, the message is broader than that, which goes to emotional well-being, which the National Institutes of Health describes as dealing with the ups and downs of life in a way that, has resilience. That's something that applies to everyone. Not everyone has a DSM diagnosed mental health condition, nor does everyone have access to going to a therapist to get diagnosed with a health condition, a mental health condition. Eating for emotional well-being can really apply to everyone. And the Mediterranean diet, which is a well-studied diet for emotional well-being, it's not just the foods that you eat. It's also taking that time, as you're talking about, Tricia, like taking that time to sit with other people. It's not something magical about the properties. It's getting the pleasure out of being with other people. And so I think that how we eat is just as important as what we eat is what the science is showing us.
And probably when we eat, it's kind of equal to all of that.
I get asked a lot of questions. I was just at South by Southwest. And
Yeah.
just to give,
How amazing was that?
Well, it's so funny because I was invited back 2 years in a row to give a solo presentation. This sounds like my humble or not so humble brag. This sounds like a brag, and I guess it is, whatever.
It's a
I'm
big
proud
deal.
of myself. Well, I'm proud of the ability to bring together research from many different areas, which goes back to Doro's initial question of you've done so many different things in your career, and I have. And that allows me the space to bring together lots of different research from lots of different areas. And the old tale about many people touching different sides of an elephant, people who are blindfolded and say, oh, it's a tree because it feels bumpy. And, they're touching the leg. And then somebody touches the tusk and says, no, it's a spear. But only somebody who can see the whole elephant can say that it's an elephant. And so that's what I try to do. At South by Southwest, they asked me to speak on this 2 years in a row as a solo presentation, which is, I don't know anybody else who has done that. I'm sure it's happened before, but there's so much research in this area that the presentation that I gave in 2023 was completely different from the presentation that I gave in 2024 because it's just exploding.
Right. We were actually saying that too, because when we started studying the microbiome, we were studying it and then talking about it at our conferences. It's got to be 10 years, probably 12 years. And then we kept bringing it up. And now it's exploded. We can understand it better, which is so amazing.
So how does the gut microbiome relate to social and emotional well-being? Because that's a huge part of your book.
Yeah, and first I'll start by defining the gut microbiome, which is the collection of trillions of microbes, which are tiny living organisms. I want to define every term because this is like body science for non-scientists, you know?
Right.
So it's the microbes, which are tiny living organisms that live inside of you. from your mouth all the way to the other end of your digestive system. And as I said, there are trillions of them. They're bacteria, they're fungi, they're viruses. And each one of those is a living thing with its own living genes that lives inside of you. So those non-human genes that live inside of you affect the way your human genes express themselves. So gut microbiomes affect sleep, sex drive. I keep talking about sex drive in this. So,
Well,
everybody's
we're
interested in sex drive.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, again, it's pleasure, right? Let's talk about it. Influences sleep, influences emotional well-being. I mean, it runs the gamut. Now, everyone's gut microbiome is different, both in the number of microbes you have inside of it and the type of microbes. And there's no one healthy gut microbiome that we know of. If you're a person in India with a healthy gut microbiome, that could be completely different from a person in China, from a person in Norway, from a person in America. Everyone's is different. But those microbes, what they eat is whatever we eat. And so when we eat things that feed those microbes, the good microbes inside of us will flourish. And by good, I hate using the terms good and bad, but it is a useful shortcut in this description because good microbes refer to the microbes inside of us that create the things, that health outcomes that we associate with good emotional well-being.
So Dora and I talk a lot about bioindividuality. So what you're saying is that each person's microbiome is their own unique microbiome.
Yes, that's right. I want to mention something important is that they're basically a factory for processing the food that we eat into things. Like there are some microbes that process the foods that we eat into long-chain fatty acids, which is great for our emotional well-being. But there are some microbes that will take that food and turn it into other substances, which are not good for our emotional well-being. And some of them live in our gut microbiome our entire lives. And some of them we eat, like yogurt, and they just pass through, but they help the workers while they're there. The probiotics that we eat, the microbes that we eat in yogurt will help the factory, but they most often do not take up residence inside of our body, which is why it's not like, oh, eat a yogurt and you'll be fine for the rest of your life.
So you can get more microbiomes, like do they seed themselves? So is it like a little plant in there so the good guys can grow if they're fed right?
It's like any other factory that you have highly specialized workers inside of it. And if you bring in other highly specialized workers to do great work, then everybody's going to work better together. If you bring in things like a lack of fiber in your diet, those microbes eat fiber. And so if you don't get enough fiber in your diet, those microbes are starving because they are living organisms that need to eat. And there's a theory, a highly supported theory, but it's still just a theory, that when the microbes are starving, they'll eat your gut lining, which is what will cause leaky gut syndrome.
Leaky gut.
Two things. One is we're focusing a lot on protein these days, a lot on protein. And it's sort of like, wait, we do need to talk about fiber as well, right? We need to eat fiber. I've read that people are not doing enough fiber, and we all realized our age group wasn't doing enough protein. So now we're like, let's do the protein, but we're forgetting the fiber. But then also, can you talk about the role of when the babies come into the world and they're inoculated? Do you talk about that at all?
Vaginal birth versus C-section.
Yeah.
And look, I have one child. I had a C-section. I am not looking for other things to feel bad about, to feel guilty about as a mom, right?
Right.
But a lot of your child's gut microbiome is populated because you don't have a gut microbiome in utero. People are born, it is strongly believed that people are born what they call germ-free because you have no microbes inside of you. The first contact that you get with a microbiome, is your mother's vaginal microbiome. You can get it in other ways, but the larger point is that human infants, newborns, could not process or digest breast milk without certain microbes in their system. That trip through the vaginal canal or whatever microbes they get in touch with, it's really important. There are a lot of things that humans can't digest without those microbes. We evolved with them. It's a co-evolution. It is believed we've always had these microbes with us and that we always will, and they're essential for our health.
You said that people that did come into this world, not vaginally, C-section, they can have healthy guts.
I have a healthy
Yeah.
16-year-old boy who is a 3 varsity sport athlete. Yes, he's doing well. As I said, I'm not looking for something else to be guilty about. But yeah, there's a lot of research being done around that. But again, it's pretty early. We don't have definite answers of like, do this and you'll be fine. So we need to understand that the ecosystem of the human body to really understand that there's a lot of different things that we need to be doing. So the handful of nuts is not going to save us in the same way that the handful of Cheetos is not going to destroy us, right? It's about a resilient system.
Is there a test you can take to check your gut microbiome?
Yes, there's an entire section in the book about that, because what you do is you send a stool sample through the mail.
Yes.
Right. And so when I was sending the package, the woman at the post office in Cleveland Park, where I live, was like, is there anything liquid, fragile, or hazardous in here? And I was like, no. But you send a stool sample through the mail and they send you back a report about your microbes. Every researcher who I've spoken with who is in the gut microbiome community, which is a growing community of researchers, has said that they are useless. Everyone that I spoke to. I'm sure that you can find somebody who says, so there are a couple reasons. Number one, you can't identify all of them. We don't know what's inside of any one person's gut microbiome because it's such a rich environment in there that the way that they test your microbiome is through looking at your stool sample. That's everywhere. And so there are things that may not survive and come out in our stool samples that could be inside of us. And there's also the second that you take anything out of that environment, that great environment of your stomach and your small intestine and all of that, it's such a fostering, lovely environment that things just die. And it's also very hard to study some of these things outside of the human body. You try to grow them in petri dishes, but we don't know how to treat all these bacteria. Each one is a living thing. It's like saying bacteria, individual bacteria, like saying humans, individual human. They're all so different, and there are ones that we haven't discovered yet. And a lot of this research, it went from the human genome research of the early aughts, at the turn of the century. I love saying that because it sounds so like the turn of the 21st century. Yeah. In the early aughts, we started to turn from the human genome mapping and the understanding of the human genome to why is it that humans and fruit flies have almost entirely the same kinds of genes inside of them, but we're also different. The theory is that what we have inside of our microbiome, these microbes, are making us so different from each other. And so it's really an area of science that has exploded. And people are looking, many researchers are looking for the one microbe to rule them all, right? Like the ring in Tolkien, that it's we found the one bacteria that makes you healthy and that makes you lose weight and all the things that people want. And it's just not like that.
And that's the one that they're all talking about now, right? Several of the companies are now coming out with just one name now, right?
Yes.
And marketing it a certain kind of way for that and this. And the question that we were going to ask you, does that work? I mean, do these probiotics really work? Can they live all the way and go down all the way? And how does that work?
As I mentioned, things that you eat or take through your mouth usually do not take up residence in your microbiome. They pass through and they help the workers that are there along the way. There have been a lot of studies, and not of branded probiotics, right? Probiotics, again, define your terms. Probiotics, that's a lawyer in me. Probiotics are these microbes that help you create better health outcomes, desirable health outcomes. That's all it means. So these probiotics, these microbes that you eat in yogurt or in supplements or whatever, there have been studies around certain strains of bacteria that show that on their own, and this is not a throw away your medication talk, but on their own, there's some evidence that the bacteria can be as effective for some people as the antidepressant Lexapro in decreasing symptoms. There is a lot of evidence also that taking them alongside each other makes it even better. They interact in some way, probiotics and the antidepressants or whatever bacteria you have living inside of you, that it creates different metabolites, the things that the microbes produce when they eat fiber. They create excess things, as humans do, as anybody does, and those are called metabolites. I'll give you a really clear example. We've heard about tryptophan in turkey that people always talk about, oh, that's what makes you feel sleepy, right? Some gut microbes will turn tryptophan into serotonin, which, as we know, is a feel-good neurotransmitter / hormone. People call it both things, but I'll call it a neurotransmitter for right now. Some microbes will turn tryptophan into kynurenine, which is an inflammatory agent that will increase inflammation in your body, and inflammation is directly tied to lower emotional well-being. It's very important to make sure that your gut microbiome is fed.
But here's the thing, you don't want to get, and this is a question,
Yep.
we don't really need to get anxious about this. what you're teaching us is while you're eating well and while you're eating not so much processed foods, you're taking care of the business, right? Because so many people say what you need to eat 30 or 32 different fruits and vegetables and all that in a week. Is that right?
Yeah, so I have two things to say about that. Number one is this is why it's so beneficial to me that I'm also a food journalist, because pleasure is really important to me. Food pleasure is really important to me. And the idea that it's like we reduce food to just like protein or carbs
right.
or whatever.
It's
it's called nutritionism, and it's bad. It doesn't bring in all the things that we know about food, how important it is for relationships, for diplomacy. I mean, you look anywhere and there's food there, and the meal is very important. And the second thing that you asked about is diversity, which is, yes, it's something called the Human Gut Project that they did as sort of the inheritor of the Human Genome Project. There was a study that 30 different, and this is in the book, that eating 30 different plants a week, people who do that have better health outcomes than people who eat 10 plants a week. Now, before you start being like, oh my gosh, 30 plants, I can't even, you're probably already eating 10 plants. Because let's think about it. Corn, wheat, soy, tomato, lettuce, onion, like a very basic McDonald's diet. People are usually eating 10 plants, right? Not to demonize McDonald's, but on a fast food diet, you're probably eating those 10 plants. But if you go to a salad bar, even once a week, and are just like, okay, and I know salad bars can be really expensive. I'm not trying to be like, let them eat cake, right? But if you go to a salad bar once a week and you fill a tray with just a spoonful of 20 different kinds of plants, or 10. It's not even a perfect, like you're not checking off a box to make sure you eat 30, but like focusing on diversity. Diversity is a strength of all ecosystems. That's just a scientific fact.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
And that's true.
I think that also goes into humans, but that's a sociological thing. But in the human body, the diversity is really important for ecosystems. It gets a lot of different things that it can work with. So yes, that is a thing. No, I would not stress about it. But yes, if you happen to be in a place where you have the resources and access to 30 different pre-cut vegetables, then go ahead and have a little bit of each, and eat them throughout the week.
One of the things that Tricia and I were talking about today were supplements. How do you feel about supplements? Because oftentimes we get prescribed or are told to take supplements. And I told Tricia this morning that I end up putting like 20 of them in my hand, shoving them in my mouth just to get it over with. And does that do any good?
First of all, as you said, health is very individual. I encourage people to talk to their doctors about this because anything that I say is not going to override your doctor being like, look, you're low on vitamin D. You need to take vitamin D, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing that I will say is that food is filled with things that you cannot get from a pill. It's as if each piece of food is a pill in and of itself because those foods, plants, have their own immune systems. They have their own defense systems, to ward off pests or too much sunlight or whatever. Parts of those immune systems are called phytochemicals or phytonutrients. And within that is again, I don't want to bring up all big words, but like polyphenols of things that those plant has that protects it, that when you eat it, it protects your body as well. There's a lot that we know now about phytonutrients, including polyphenols, including flavonoids, which is why you hear things like eat the rainbow, right? Because flavonoids, what kind of flavonoid the plant has depends on what color it is. Like red plants, like red peppers, have different flavonoids than green peppers. And that's why it's just like focus on diversity. Don't focus on perfection because we don't know. Each plant is a pill in and of itself, but like we don't know how. It's just human hubris to think that we can, replicate that. That said, it is all very individual. Talk to your doctor about it, but pills are not a substitute for plants. And talk to your doctor and choose your doctor really carefully. That's the other thing.
Right.
I mean, if you even have access to medical care, I mean, that's what I'm saying. I think all of this is a social justice issue, but I also think that's probably a different podcast that we're talking. And the book, it focuses on individual health. I have done food policy in the past. I am deeply interested in it. Our food system right now in America, about 60% of it is ultra-processed food. You can't just pull that out of the food system and expect everyone to be okay with it. Ultra-processed food exists for a reason, and not just like I'm talking about like a privileged person who's like, oh, sometimes I like to eat Cheetos, There are people who only have access to ultra-processed food because it is inexpensive, It is available everywhere. It is shelf stable, so you don't have to worry about refrigerating it. You don't have to prepare it, so you don't need that extra time. I don't want to demonize ultra-processed foods because I think that negates the experience of many, perhaps the majority of people who survive on ultra-processed foods. And that's why I think as an individual health issue, let's talk about all this. Let's make sure we're taking care of our individual health if we have the time and access to it. Also, think about how that might be a social justice issue for people who don't have access to that privilege. Consider whether, as my therapist would say, consider whether that is a social justice issue.
Mary Beth, thank you for such an incredible conversation.
I really am grateful to you for giving me the space to talk about this to a new audience.
We look forward to having you back next week for the second part of this conversation. So please join us, everybody.
Oh, anytime.
Thank you for joining us on Health Gig. We loved having you with us. We hope you'll tune in again next week. In the meantime, be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast and follow us on healthgigpod.com. I'm Tricia.
And I'm Doro.
Be well.